If you burn your hand and you put it in cold water, you can actually stop the development of the damage just by being cold enough for long enough and doing it soon enough. Then why can't you cool an injured brain?
What we do know is that just reducing brain temperature by literally 3 or 4 degrees centigrade can make a huge difference.
It's a treatment but not a cure at the moment, and we're going for a cure.
If this treatment works, then it would therefore be logical to think it would do a considerable amount of good in the third world.
Every year, more than 1,000 babies in Britain and many more in the developing world suffer brain damage due to either a lack of oxygen at birth or, in the case of premature babies, a brain hemorrhage, both leading to severe disabilities. But pioneering work being undertaken by doctors mainly in Britain offers the first real hope to these babies.
When the baby was delivered, it was overwhelming joy, you know, but then I saw something was wrong. I knew it wasn't right, all these people rushing in, and I knew obviously there was something wrong. You know, I was just praying that everything was going to turn out okay.
It was the last couple of seconds, really, that the problem started. There seemed to be lack of oxygen to the baby in the last couple of seconds of the birth.
I heard them sort of say that they needed to, you know, have some adrenaline for Katie because, you know, her condition had deteriorated.
Dr. Torrenson came into the delivery suite and started explaining that there was something wrong with her brain. And she mentioned that there was this trial being done here and we needed to sign up to it there and then because there's I think it was six hours it had to be started, and it was coming to the end of those 6 hours.
Bristol in the west of England is at the forefront of a medical trial involving London, New Zealand and North America. The trial involves cooling the heads of newborn babies with brain damage. Dr. Marianne Thoresen, born in Norway, is head cooling Katie, the 13th baby in the trial. They need 230 babies to take part before they can determine the success rate. It's a randomized trial, so half will be head cooled, half will not.
When she was 6 hours old, we started to cool her down to rectal temperature 33.5. Normal temperature for babies is of course 37, and the way we do that is by cooling her head down using a cooling cap. And you can just see the edge of the plastic cap here where we flow cold water all the time around the head of the baby. So that is enough to cool the whole baby down, and this treatment goes on for 72 hours and then she will be rewarmed to normal temperature. These are the water tubes that takes the water in and out of the cap, so the cold water comes in through the blue one here and it goes out through this cap to be cooled again through the machine. From the skin on her head we are recording the EEG, the brain wave or the brain activity, and the signals go through 3 leads, which you can see here, and which then goes on to the machine, making the blue trace, which is the continuous brainwave activity. Fortunately, the trace now looks quite good. It's difficult to say anything about the future at this early stage. There are lots of good signs for her, but I think one has to be guarded at this early stage.
100 miles away at the University College Hospital in London, Professor John Wyatt coordinates the trial, called the Olympic Trial, after its American sponsors.
The idea of cooling babies after birth has actually been around for hundreds of years, and there was an old treatment which involved putting babies in ice-cold water after birth in order to encourage them to breathe. In the 1950s, there were studies involving doctors in Scandinavia particularly, where they had a specialised cooling bath. They put babies in this ice-cold water, and in fact their results were remarkably good.
Cooling was first documented in the late 1600s, when James Curry, who invented the thermometer, wrote about cooling to treat people with fevers and other diseases. Drawings from that time show a child fitting, placed in a tub of cold water. It was even used to treat syphilis. The Russians introduced head cooling for brain injuries. But it was a Swedish doctor, Björn Westin, who introduced the idea of total body cooling in the 1950s to treat babies starved of oxygen during birth.
I read some old papers from the 1950s and 60s, in particular by Björn Westin, a Swedish obstetrician. He took newborn infants who were unable to breathe by themselves when they were born and actually dumped them into cold water. And in his paper he describes how they all started to breathe and they developed normally. I was really inspired by that work and wanted to take it up again. It's actually normal to be cold after a period of too little oxygen, because naturally your metabolism is switched off or reduced. So all newborn animals, for instance, if they suffer too little oxygen, they will become cold naturally. So if we then actively heat them up, that is, it may be damaging actually if we do that for babies who are very sick at birth.
Reese was Dr. Tureson's first baby she body-cooled 2 years ago, before the Olympic trials started. He'd been starved of oxygen at birth and was seriously ill.
There was problems while I was in labour. He was being monitored. The midwives were concerned because his pulse rate was dropping. Apparently Reese took his first gasp at 3 minutes, but failed to breathe spontaneously on his own. The doctors explained that because he was starved of oxygen, there was a risk of him having brain damage.
He needed full resuscitation. We needed to compress his chest. He had drugs to stimulate his heart, and he had very abnormal movements. And when we did this, the EEG test, it was a very abnormal and what we call a rather flat pattern he had. So he more than fulfilled the criteria for being entered into the trial.
The method of cooling a baby's body has evolved gradually, and there are various methods used. This time Dr. Tureson improvised with rubber gloves filled with cool water. This was Reese's bed for 72 hours.
Rubber gloves stuck all around. It looked really weird, didn't it?
Yes.
And then when those started warming up, they'd have to go and get some more out of the fridge. He was just, well, his lips were blue. He was shivering.
He felt cold to touch, didn't he?
Cold to touch, yeah. We were worried about the shivering. Looked as though he was fitting, so that was a bit concerning, wasn't it? Mm. He just looked very strange there, didn't he? Mm. And he just wanted to pick him up and cuddle him, didn't he?
Yes. I wanted to pick him up, I wanted to breastfeed him. I wanted to do all the things that mothers do, and I couldn't cuddle him. That was the most difficult thing. And I remember at one stage watching him, he'd actually managed to get hold of a rubber glove finger that was filled with water, and he was sucking on it. And I thought, he shouldn't be doing that. It should be me that's helping him. Just felt a bit useless sitting there watching him. I felt cheated. But we were happy to try anything.
2 years on, and life is very different.
Very strong-willed, very stubborn, very determined if he If he sets out to do something, he has to complete that task.
He's a little angel. Well, he's my little angel. I spoiled him. His mother says I spoiled him, but I'm just so, well, we're both over the moon with him.
He's full of energy.
Yeah, he's non-stop.
He doesn't stop, and I think when you're older parents, it's exhausting. He wears us out, but it's wonderful that he wears us out. If he wasn't doing all those active things, he would be normal.
Gotcha.
It's been wonderful to see him develop. It's amazing. I just saw him in clinic when he was 2 years old, and he's an absolutely normal 2-year-old child. He is.
What we think is the most important thing is to get the brain temperature, the temperature of the brain cells, at about 33 degrees centigrade, which is about 4 degrees below normal brain temperature. What we don't know is what's the best way of actually achieving that, and we have a number of alternatives. One possibility is to cool the head, and another possibility is to cool the whole body.
The Hammersmith Hospital in London was one of the first to body cool a baby. The baby was surrounded by a plastic blanket and cooled by blowing air over its body to lower its temperature by 4 degrees centigrade. Doctors here believe body cooling is the most effective method.
I think the evidence at the moment would suggest that head cooling will only work if you cool the entire body. I would base that statement on some experimental work which would suggest that to be the case, and also computer simulations of the heat flux across the brain. I think you actually have to cool the whole body in some form or other in order to cool the centre of the brain.
The machine used at the Hammersmith resembled a hairdryer, and that's one advantage of body cooling: low-tech and inexpensive. In time, it could be adapted for the developing world.
The one thing that body cooling has going for it is simplicity. The intrinsic physics involved are simple. They're not complicated. If you can find a way of controlling temperature within 5 degrees, then you don't need complicated drugs. The equipment could, in theory, be quite simple, and it could be applied by relatively unskilled people. So in theory, it could be a very useful thing in the third world, where the problem of birth asphyxia seems to have a higher incidence than it does in Europe.
Back in Bristol, it's almost time for the cooling cap to be taken away from Katie, and for her parents to hold her for the first time.
And you know, it's just 1 hour left of the cooling, so we will now have just half the amount of drugs that makes her quieter. Yeah. And when we stop the cooling, we'll stop all the drugs. It's been difficult not to be able to hold her.
It has, yes. And I think what upset me the first morning was I saw like the newborn baby clothes I bought her, and I thought I just put them in something. You know, one of the baby clothes. You know, that's what upset me the first morning. But after that, I was fine, wasn't I? Yeah.
There are a number of theories around as to why cooling actually seems to protect the brain. One obvious one is that it reduces the metabolic rate of the brain. But in fact, that's probably not the whole answer. And it may be that it has much more complex effects in terms of altering the balance between cell signaling, the ways that cells talk to each other, but also the balance between the destroying processes inside the brain and the repairing processes inside the brain.
Dr. Hussein Mehmed's team at the Hammersmith Hospital in London has conducted groundbreaking research into what happens to babies' brain cells when starved of oxygen.
During brain injury, a lot of cells are damaged and die. The problem is that the brain has rather limited powers of regeneration. So once you lose brain cells, they largely remain irreplaceable.
There are 2 ways cells die. The first is called necrosis, which is a form of cell murder. The cell bursts, and that's the end of it. Or a cell dies by apoptosis, which is a form of cell suicide. Cells shrink and then are eaten up by their neighbours.
The time it takes for a cell to die by apoptosis is very short. But the events that can trigger apoptosis are what linger on after the primary insult. And this is what gives us the opportunity between the primary event and the delayed cell death that goes on afterwards to intervene.
Research has shown that damage to the brain can continue for 72 hours or more after the initial insult. But if the brain is cooled within hours of the initial injury, the process of cell death can be halted, giving doctors more time to intervene with drugs.
If you can manage to block apoptosis in newborn infants where the brain is not fully developed, this can be the difference between having an adult that's very severely handicapped and having one that perhaps has minor motor or learning difficulties. And so the social implications of this are huge.
The 72 hours are up, and Katie's cap is coming off.
Not that cold.
No, it just felt cold considering the heat was right here.
Yeah. The reason she needs the ventilator now is actually because we have given her some drugs, so she's a bit more quiet.
It's good to see you.
What's going to happen now? We will rewarm her very slowly.
Yeah.
And after 6 hours, she will normal temperature.
Right.
And I expect her to be able to breathe by tomorrow. So now, and from tomorrow onwards, we can start giving her a bit of breast milk from you.
From tomorrow?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're gonna lie down. Yeah, and then we just have to wait and see how she recovers.
Yeah.
Dr. Tureson is married to Professor Andrew Whitelaw, who's also involved in the cooling trial. But Professor Whitelaw is conducting his own treatment, the first in the world, for premature babies who suffer brain hemorrhaging at birth. Kelsey Ann weighed just over 1,200 grams when she and her twin sister were born at 29 weeks. She's Professor Whitelaw's 17th baby to undergo this new experimental treatment of brainwashing. Doctors are inserting 2 tubes into Kelsey Ann's brain. One takes a clot-dissolving liquid into the swollen ventricles, and the other drains the liquid and debris away.
Kelsey has had bleeding into the ventricles of the brain as a consequence of her premature birth and the complications involved with twin pregnancy, and she is now developing hydrocephalus, that is, the fluid within the brain is building up under pressure and it's beginning to expand both her brain and her head.
This is a normal baby's brain with the ventricles hardly visible. But when a brain hemorrhage takes place, the ventricles swell and fill with blood. If untreated, it leads to brain damage and severe disability.
What we are doing is trying to remove as much of the blood as possible from inside the brain. So what we're doing is we're irrigating and draining at the same time. What is probably important is that the timing. We think this process by which scar formation occurs probably is decided within 3 to 4 weeks. of the baby having a hemorrhage. And in Kelsey Ann's case, we're at 19 days. So we hope we're just about within the time frame that we can stop this process from becoming permanently established. Right, do you want to come along and we'll have a look and see how things have been going since we started this morning. She certainly doesn't look too stressed at the moment, does she? We would like to see the fluid clearing even more.
Is it going to be as clear as what's going in?
It doesn't have to be as clear as that. We have this grading of cerebrospinal fluid from Beaujolais through Coca-Cola to rosé to Scotch whisky, cider, through to Liebfrau milk, and then finally ending up with vodka. And you don't quite have to get to the vodka clear to be doing quite well. So
what's coming out is actually not as bad as what you've seen?
Oh no, the fluid coming out now is more like white wine almost, isn't it? With a little bit of debris in it, whereas when it was first coming out it was much more like sort of mixture of cider and Coca-Cola, really.
Yeah, we just sit and wait.
Yes,
Fingers
that's
crossed.
right. Yeah. I do want to encourage you to touch her a wee bit. We're very aware of the fact that small babies in incubators don't get much touch. Touch is really a sort of basic human need, and rather that we could get you to relax using stroking than that we have to use morphine to achieve the same effect.
Brooke Taylor was one of the first babies in the world to be brainwashed by Professor Whitelaw. She was born 2 years ago, 7 weeks early, with a hemorrhage that nearly killed her.
I was terrified, to be honest with you. I just cried most of the time. The thought of her going through all that at such an early age, it was horrible. Do it. 2. If she would have had brain damage, they said she wouldn't be able to walk. She'd have cerebral palsy, she would have had a limp or a speech problem. But luckily, she hasn't. And she's here, fit, fighting with us now. Aren't you? She's bubbly. She's speaking a few words. She copies. She can nearly count now.
Really, up until now, we haven't had very much to offer these babies at all, except the prospect of having repeated punctures to temporarily relieve pressure, and then having a permanent shunt system by which you're dependent upon a plumbing system, really, with a one-way valve going from the brain into the tummy, a system which can malfunction at any time, really, in your life, where you may suddenly get a blockage and become very ill and have to go back into hospital as an emergency for an operation, and where you really can't live a very long distance away from a neurosurgical department. So it's a treatment but not a cure at the moment, and we're going for a cure.
The brainwashing treatment is over, and Kelsey Ann's progress is being closely monitored.
This is now 4 days since we finished the drift treatment on Kelsey, and now she's digesting milk all on her own. She doesn't even need an intravenous line. She's making nice normal movements. She's sort of stretching, opening her fingers, moving her face a little bit. These are all very nice normal movements for a baby of this age.
Brain damage at birth cannot be reversed, but Professor Whitelaw is hopeful that his treatment can stop it from progressing.
Now the left ventricle looks pretty clear in terms of blood clot. In other words, it's just black. Also very importantly, the brain substance itself on the side of the ventricular system looks a normal sort of grey colour and not either bright white or very dark black, either of which would indicate damage. So far so good. We've done our treatment. We've washed out obviously a lot of the blood clots. we've been measuring the head circumference daily, and it's not increasing. There's definitely no increased pressure in her head. The ventricles are significantly smaller, despite the fact that we haven't drained any fluid over the last 4 days. So I'm quite happy with the way things are going. So the next step actually will be to begin to try and get her to feed for herself, and that will be the road to home.
Kelsey Ann is now at home and reunited with her twin sister.
It's been brilliant, actually. We were really worried that we'd have to bring Christina home and leave Kelsey behind. But she's come on leaps and bounds since they've been together. Little miracles, that's what they are.
It will be some time before the success of brainwashing and head cooling can be established, but the signs are hopeful.
If you think that you have helped the baby to develop normally, of course, it's a great satisfaction. And it is such a devastating condition to have, to develop cerebral palsy, that if you can avoid or maybe reduce the severity by some form of intervention, it's really worth it.